Hello, my name is, the cheeky one is the moderator. My name is Sarah Lewis. I'm with Fuss & O'Neill, who are based in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm also a CNU National Board member and general all-around architect, urbanist, and meddler. The title of this session is The Real Deal Implemented Incremental Urbanism. And yes, it's a mouthful. What we're hoping to do is we have three speakers, and essentially as the new world economy is changing and our projects and our practices are adapting to new economic conditions, environmental conditions that we should have been dealing with for so very long, incremental urbanism, construction, smaller scale projects are going to become more of the norm than they have the big scale work that everybody has been doing for the last 20 years or so. So we're hoping to look at these, we're going to look at these different projects from perspectives of some of the economics of the deal, some of the hurdles that went through land use ordinances and approvals, and then even some phasing construction issues of an adaptive reuse building. And from pretty much, we've got coast to coast covered. So our speakers are from Marcy McAnally is architect from Portland, Oregon. Who's going to go next? Don. Don is from also an architect. We have a bunch of architects up here. Architect from Providence, Rhode Island. And then Rob Sharp is from Fayetteville, Arkansas. Couple of small things that I'm supposed to read and let you know. This session is approved for 1.25 AIA and AICP continuing education credits. AIA, there's a form in the back. Hopefully you saw it when you came in. If not, sign it on the way out. For AICP, attendees report attendance online at planning.org/cm and search for event number 19209 for a list of all sessions and tours regarding CNU 20. So as our speakers go through their presentations, please think about questions for them on their projects or your own work so that we can at least have an informed discussion, question and answers towards the end. Appreciate it. So without further ado, as they say, Marcy McAnally.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about a project that is actually just being adopted currently. It's been in the process for about a year now, and it's for the city of Milwaukee. That's not spelled the way you think it should be. It's actually spelled with an IE. Oregon. Someone once told me that's spelled wrong. That's how they want to spell it in Oregon. Small town south of Portland, Oregon. First I want to show you their website. This is the website that's devoted to this project. I'm going to talk about although I am speaking about the codes, the codes piece of implementing infill design, specifically a residential infill amendments to the city code. I'm going to talk about how we did that because I have a lot of experience with infill development, and as a former Portland Planning Commissioner, I have a lot of experience also with getting communities comfortable with compact housing and infill. And so I decided that, and I was able to convince the client, the city of Milwaukee in this case, that they should go about this differently than many jurisdictions do, and that they should actually look at a multi-layered approach where we appealed to people by one, that this four-part kind of approach. One, we show them the problem with their current code by actually illustrating what results under their current development standards. And then we could show them models of what would be better, what seemed to fit, the feedback that we were receiving from the community. And then we show them, we give them actually a tour guide so they can go around and look at where this exists within the region and see built examples. And finally, on the kind of appealing to the rational and the emotional level, at the same time we developed some demographic trends research and then illustrated that in a way that would appeal to the community and show them both why it's important to think about infill housing and how they could personally benefit from accepting greater infill housing in their communities, and but care about the design of it. So I'm going to go through a series of the products that I created with the city for this project, and I'm going to try to do this in 15 minutes, which means I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the images, and I hope that we could come back to them if there's interest during the conversation period. So first we showed the problem, but first let me talk about where this town is within the city of, within the metropolitan region of Portland. It's, as you may know, we're one of the rare metropolitan areas in the country to have an urban growth boundary. It's a requirement for every city in our state. And within the metro region around Portland, we have a number of cities and counties, I think exactly 26 cities and 3 counties, that are all part of our MPO, our Council of Governments, that's called Metro, and again in another first, it's one of 2 elected regional governments in the country. So it means we can do a lot of things about infill. First of all, infill is encouraged, growing in and not out. And the Metro regional government has, over the last couple of decades, developed a lot of tools to help local cities and towns do better planning around for these issues. And Milwaukee is on the next line of our light rail system. It's to the south. It's right here. And this is the center of Portland, and this is Washington State. Just a little orientation. It's a small city. So first part of the 4-part exercises was we showed what would happen under the existing code, and we modeled it in a very simple graphic way. We chose several sites for it that are subject to multifamily residential zoning right now. These were actual sites, but we attempted to genericize them a little bit so people wouldn't know that it was their property. We laid out the zoning code standards, the setbacks, the heights, the FAR, and then we modeled that just to show people exactly what they might see on their neighboring property under this zoning. And given that this is a community of, it's got a lot of multifamily zoning in it, but it hasn't been taken advantage of. It still is, it was a part of that wave of multifamily rezoning that happened in the 60s and 70s, and has mostly still single-dwelling detached homes in it. So when people realized what the existing zoning code would allow, it was upsetting. But that was actually part of our strategy, was to show that there needed to be more care, there needed to be some amendments to their zoning code for multifamily dwelling. And we did this on a number of sites. I'm just going to run through these quickly. You can see how big and bulky these developments are. And one subtlety about the drawing is that the red, or the salmon-colored area represents the maximum buildable area. But in the worst-case scenario, from a bulk perspective and incompatibility, there's nothing preventing the development from actually reaching into the back of the site area as well. And that was something we wanted to make very clear. So the incompatible bulk and height and the perhaps the unrealistic setbacks were all quite helpful for people to see. So the second part of the exercise is we illustrated some alternative housing types. And these are really housing types that have emerged over the last couple of decades. I think most of you are familiar with these, but a lot of people who think of multifamily housing zones think just of apartment buildings, stacked flats. They don't think about there might be an opportunity for row houses or cottage cluster or some other newer options that new urbanists are actually quite good at designing and getting built. So we took one of those subject sites that we had illustrated before, and then we showed what it would be like if we, one, put row houses on it, and we were attempting to achieve the maximum density allowed, which was 8 units. The row house model didn't meet that, but that's kind of an issue with the row house model. The cottage cluster, which is a new type of housing that there's a company out of Seattle, Washington called the Cottage Company, which has popularized a code module that's been adopted into codes by several Northwest cities, including Bainbridge Island, Whidbey Island, parts of Seattle, and we wanted to take that model. It's a really easy to like kind of housing type. It generally doubles the density on a typical residential lot, but it does it in a way that is small and compatible with lots of green space. It's kind of for the apartment dweller, the person who might not want to live in an apartment, would rather have a garden, but wants a small house. And these are generally required through the Cottage Company's model ordinance to be under 1,000 square feet. So it can also be an affordable housing choice, but most of the developments that have been built are extremely expensive because they're very popular. So we modeled that 8 units on that same site and showed what it would look like next to sample dwellings nearby. Then we did something, a high-rise, so-called, for Milwaukee type high-rise, and modeled that. This would be maybe your typical multi-dwelling apartment flat type building. And finally we did a smaller low-rise building, but one that had duplexes and larger. These are more like 2,000 square foot units stacked, but in pairs. So that was the second part of the exercise, modeling the ideal. The third part of the exercise was showing examples that were in the region that people could go visit. So we created a self-guided tour guide and illustrated it with addresses and photos, and then sent people out. The Planning Commission actually organized a tour, and people went out on a bus and looked at some of these. We tried to select development from all over the region, so it was not Portland that was represented, because as you can imagine, Portland is the center of the most progressive new development in the region, and most of the small cities chafe at being compared with Portland, or being asked to emulate Portland in any way. So we tried to get as many of these units out in the outer areas, but to be honest, most of them do exist within the city of Portland. We cataloged them in several categories, from accessory dwelling units to duplexes to row houses and narrow lot houses, and the cottage cluster, which there are several examples of this development type in the Portland area as well. Oh, and then we also had the garden courtyard, some of which are historic examples. So the fourth exercise was a much more extensive effort by itself, where I conducted some research on new demographic trends that support compact housing, and then turned that into a series of slides that we could present at a community meeting to help people understand what compact housing really means, what accessory dwelling units look like, who tends to live in them, why they can be a benefit, what cottage clusters look like, and et cetera, who lives in them and why they can be a benefit. And the entire goal of this exercise was to both appeal on the rational level, so people could see the trends that are supporting houses are downsizing, the family, that in spite of the fact that we are building bigger houses, there are fewer and fewer people who need to live in big houses. That hasn't stopped the home building industry. They continue to build them. But the demographics trends show us that those houses are not appropriate anymore. There's a much greater need for smaller, more flexible housing. There's also a greater need for multifamily housing that is smaller, but not all the traditional apartment type setting. People want to live in a small apartment type dwelling, but they may want to have ground floor access or access to a garden. So we were also trying to show that multifamily housing shouldn't just be one housing type. It shouldn't just be apartment buildings. And Milwaukee's code, as many cities' codes do, unwittingly eliminates all other options. Only apartment buildings are allowed in their code right now. You couldn't build a cottage cluster if you wanted to in this area, even if it met the same density, because the code's development standards don't allow it. So I'm going to run through this pretty quickly too, and I want to start out by saying that I hired a copywriter and a graphic designer to help me with this, because I knew that to communicate this complicated demographic information, we would need to have really good taglines, really good photographs, and a really good sequence of images. So I'm going to go through some of the trends first. You probably, being the new urbanist audience that you are, you're probably familiar with these, but believe me, a lot of people don't understand this. Household sizes are shrinking. Part of this is the baby boomers. Part of it is Generation Y. A third huge factor in this is immigrants and their children that are seeking more compact housing but multi-generational housing. And this was done in 2011. It's not out of date, but and I still think we can say this about homeownership. It will return to pre-boom. It will probably not return to pre-boom levels. More people will rent by choice and necessity, and there's going to continue to be a strong real estate market for rental units. In fact, there's a supply issue. I'm not going to go through all of these, but part of the reason that American households are shrinking, the type that that home builders tend to build homes for, the 2 parents and 2.5 children, this type of house now only accounts for about 1/3 of all that's housing starts, which is the way that the U.S. Census describes people who are moving into a unit, whether it's rental or a house. And partly this is because of single parent families, and a lot of these are women. Housing costs are often more than 50% of monthly income for these people. The home building industry has failed to recognize these trends, and since the 1950s, even while household sizes have shrunk, the size of the average house has doubled. Then I talked about the baby boomers and their housing choices and their tendencies. They're tending to want to downsize, to rent for lifestyle reasons, and aging in place is a huge unmet need. The children of the baby boomers, who are now their teens and early 30s, at 83 million individuals, they are becoming and will be a dominant force in the economy, and they tend to prefer walkable urban areas, neighborhoods with racial, ethnic diversity, and green design, and they're willing to pay more for that. And foreign-born people, this is one of the most interesting trends that I read about. These are first-generation immigrants. These people tend to be younger, have larger families and more traditional households. That's the first generation. They prefer the larger houses. They tend to live in poverty and have lower education levels. They'll tend to choose suburban locations for reasons probably other than choice. But their second generation, their children, typically will move to national norms in education, income, and lifestyle, and have higher household incomes than others in their age group. So they will excel beyond the American-born children in their age group. So what does this all mean for home ownership? And Milwaukee was, in the end, I wanted to communicate that they need to think about producing enough urban housing to meet the demand that they're going to have through baby boomers and through millennials. And they have good walkable areas within their community now, but they don't allow much infill. They really only allow that kind of rental housing, apartment-type housing. Infill can be costly, and communities that make way for it through their codes and in other areas are going to get better, higher quality infill housing. So it was a message to Milwaukee to get ready and get it right. I also wanted to appeal to the do-it-yourselfers. It's a very big thing in small communities like Milwaukee. The people who benefit from small infill housing are often the property owners themselves. This isn't a developer-driven movement. People who can benefit from small infill housing are often the people who own that property, who can build an accessory dwelling unit or double the size of their home, double the number of units in their home through modifications allowed by the zoning code. So these are the demographic trends and how we illustrated them, and I'm going to run through them quickly and not dwell on the data. We chose a photo and a tagline for each of these groups. First we had the baby boomers, who talk about how they raise their kids in their community, and all their friends are there, and they'd like to age there. And we presented some statistics in an easy-to-understand way. And then we talked about the housing types that they might choose. This group, for instance, might build an accessory dwelling unit and then eventually live in that and rent the main dwelling out. Or the accessory dwelling unit might be a source of income for renting to others. And we talked about the trend of slightly younger baby boomers, because the recession has caused a split between the baby boom generation to those that are more affluent and older, and those that are now what we called upside down. That was our tagline for them. Because some of these have bought houses at the height of the market and are suffering now because they're underwater mortgaged. But they might like to downsize, but can't. But if they had the flexibility to change some things about their current dwelling, they might be able to add rental income. So we talk about statistics again and housing types again. And the third trend illustrated was like the young family. This is one of the millennial types. People who grew up in the suburbs and now want to live in an urban area. They want access to farmers markets, local shops. Walking to school is important for them to have their children do that. And they're fleeing the suburbs for the urban areas. And they're interested in more urban-style housing. They may be the ones that take advantage of some of these newer types of housing, the cottage cluster or the compact row house, for instance. And then we illustrated the single mom, very typical family type these days, who wants to be close to a good, strong community, wants to be safe for her kids to walk home from school, be close to the public school, be part of a family community, but can't afford a house in the community. Now, this is really a typical situation. So what is the option for most women in this situation? They would generally be segregated into the rental district, into an apartment. So we were appealing to, let's think about providing another housing type mixed into the community, mixed in with single dwelling, detached residential buildings on green, leafy, walkable streets for these people. Again, we talked about the trends. We illustrated with the photographic examples. We talk about the young couple. And that, in fact, this is one of the most interesting facts, I think, that in 1950, the average size of new single-family homes was 3.5, and the house size was very small, and now we're down to 2.5, and the house size is more than doubled. But these people, a couple like this, may also not want to live in an apartment, but they don't need much room. They'd like to have a yard. Maybe the cottage cluster model is perfect for them. And finally, we talked about the larger multi-generational immigrant family, generations under one roof, talking about the trends, and we particularly pointed out in Milwaukee the immigrant trends and the housing types. And for them, much of the housing that is being built may be perfectly appropriate, but its transit and transportation accessibility is not so good and could be improved. And the younger people graduating from school with not much money, going to have to wait some time before they can purchase a home, having to live in an alternative, perhaps what they hadn't imagined before, and they're just starting out. So this is how we illustrated the trends for people. In the end, the community overwhelmingly supported allowing these new housing types, from accessory dwelling units to within single dwelling zones, and then in multi-dwelling zones, they agreed to allow, they supported allowing cottage clusters and row houses that meet more smaller setbacks and other standards and could be more compact, and other types of compact housing, such as duplexes that they hadn't allowed in those zones before, in addition to what is currently allowed, which is typically apartment buildings. I think it's a very promising sign. And that's the end of my presentation.
Hi, everybody. I'm Don Powers, principal of Union Studio, a 13-person firm in Providence, Rhode Island. We've been longtime members here at the CNU, and I'm looking forward to presenting some of our work and talking to you about the hurdles we've had in making it happen. What I wanted to do here is a four-part presentation. The first one's going to take about 10 seconds. I'm going to recap the recent history of the last 10 years in 4 or 5 seconds. Then I'm going to talk about 3 projects, possibly 3 if I have enough time, but definitely 2. Trinity Place, which is an infill project which had many different components, both physical, funding, and regulatory. I'm going to talk about Green Street, which is a small cottage development we were both architects for and co-developers on. And then I'm going to talk about Capitol Square, if I have time, which is a infill project, which really isn't. It's a standalone building in a neighborhood, but it's creating infill around it. So the recent history, I'll take you through this quickly. Gas prices are high. Main streets are destroyed. Traffic is bad. Green fields are gone. Polar bears are sad. Okay? And I think the good news about all of that is that sort of stopped in 2009, as a lot of us who are in the construction and design industry realize. And with the domino effect of the economy crashing, housing starts plummeting, this kind of activity came to a screeching halt. There are simultaneous, Marcy did a much more elegant job, or eloquent job, of describing the demographic trends, which are taking people from a Hummer to a Prius, and all of that, the implications that has for our housing choices and otherwise. But basically, the message, the good news for us, is that there's a return, at least in segments of the society, to an understanding that the places that we love the most are the best planned and are the ones that were planned the way we always did until we screwed it up. So the new urbanists have been working on this, and this is our moment. And one of the big rubs against the new urbanists is all of our work in the green fields, and we're building these new neighborhoods, but we're neglecting the infrastructure that's been left behind. Well, this is our chance to prove them differently, prove otherwise. So with that preamble, that quick preamble, I just wanted to look at a couple of projects, this one being called Trinity Place, the second one Green Street, and the third Capitol Square. Trinity Place is really about solving an infill puzzle in a difficult part of Providence, Rhode Island. The center of Providence is right there where that yellow circle is. You can see the Providence River coming up on the to the east. And Trinity Place is located on the west side at the confluence of a couple of major boulevards. The west side was, until the freeway went through, the Providence's equivalent of the Back Bay in Boston, where the nouveau riche and the money from the last century began to develop. That was pretty much stopped in its tracks in the first part of this century. But the site in particular is right there, and it's really the cobbling together of a number of lots that were for sale, with the notable exception of the most important corner, which is and remains a gas station, but we hope that will not be that way forever. So just to give you a sense of the tired site that we inherited, there's a large cathedral church behind, but that's the gas station on the corner. I think the gray sky is mirrored by the kind of gray and depressing urbanism as well. The site, just to do a quick basic analysis, which for the architects will be perfunctory, and for others you may find it interesting, but there was retail frontage existing, or retail or institutional frontage, fragmented, left on the street. Going down Arch Street, we had a residential scale, on the scale of 5,000 square foot lots of singles and two families. That was mirrored again on Bridgham Street, but then on the other side of Bridgham Street, over the years of urban renewal and various other things, there developed a kind of townhouse scale, a affordable townhouse scale, and that is also mirrored by the fact that Bridgham Street is a much major thoroughfare, so it has a different scale to it. So our proposal was obviously going to respect the retail frontage on Elmwood. It was going to understand that you needed some sort of hyphen or transition between that and the residential scale behind it. And then this missing tooth over on Bridgham Street was another animal altogether. So our original plan was just as literal as that, a number of pieces of building that comprised different types, townhouses, apartment buildings, mixed-use buildings, and another group of townhouses. And we sold it in the public realm just in the basic urbanism of using the infill to help knit together the neighborhood. So we talked about the scale being appropriate for retail on Elmwood Avenue, and that the buildings were appropriately higher, and notably higher than the zoning allowed. But that as we turned the corner and went down Arch Street, we would change in scale to a townhouse model that expressed each townhouse as a row house, and that would blend into the existing character of the neighborhood as you went down the neighborhood. As the proposal firmed up, those buildings became more clear. There was retail, a small amount of retail, 3,500 square feet on the main block, with an apartment building above it on 3 floors with 12 units, 4 units per floor above that. This was our proposal at which we presented it in the public realm. The other type of building was a straight flat building, walk-up flat, 3 stories. All of this, by the way, I should digress and say the client here was a community development corporation, and because of that, it has its own opportunities and its own drawbacks. The opportunity is that they're eligible for all sorts of funding and kind of virtual equity that a conventional developer can't get. The other side of that is that you've got 15 different clients anytime you design a project, including everybody who's got even a nickel of money into the project. So these were all designed to be affordable at anywhere from 60% to 100% of area median income. Then the fourth type, or the third type on there, were townhouse buildings. And this is interesting because the townhouse units were meant to be for sale. And this was one of the political decisions relative to permitting an affordable project. Obviously, folks don't, many municipalities, they fear a largely rental, affordable project in their neighborhood. But if you introduce the element of home ownership into the project in these townhouse forms, it sort of leavens the mix a little bit, where people feel somehow that home ownership context will make the whole development a little less threatening to the neighborhood. So those were the townhouses on Arch Street. These are the townhouses on Bridgham Street, and these are the townhouses on Arch Street. We also planned and spoke about it in the public process of the future development of when the gas station went away, which we hope it will someday, and how Arch Street would complete the block with parking on the interior of the block. So these are the overall views of those blocks as they were designed. As I said, these 2 units were apartment buildings, and they were funded completely through the low-income housing tax credit program. And that comes with all sorts of restrictions. It can only be rental. One creative way we made the numbers work on this, and I don't want to take credit for this, this was my client, was that where we had a small amount of retail built into it, that adds an additional funding source into the mix that can push these things just slightly over the line into being viable, into being an investment that people want to take for the tax credit. So one message out of this project is the creative use of programming and the different funding sources that either are available because of that programming or restricted because of it, and mixing that alphabet soup together to get one package that works. Likewise, the market rate townhouses were designed as fee simple lots, which is interesting because the city of Providence has no history of townhouse lots anywhere in it. When we proposed that we were going to make a series of lots for these townhouses that were 18 feet wide by 80 feet deep, a lot of the people on the Planning Commission thought we were insane, and we had to educate them that this is a common dimension that happens in the Back Bay in Boston frequently, and that the benefit of this, of designing the lot to function as a fee simple lot, would give them the opportunity to get home ownership into that neighborhood, a neighborhood that would become largely absentee landlord rental units. So this is how the project has come out so far. The 2 components, the rental unit buildings have been built. This is the one on Elmwood Avenue, the back of it facing the interior of the block. and then the affordable 10-unit multifamily that faces Bridgham Street. So lessons learned. For the maximum value, design beyond the largest context possible, and we always do that as a firm. We will design, we will take over anybody's lot who's anywhere near us and make a proposal for the next 50 years, whether they want us to or not. But the benefit of that is that you create a value, you create a master plan that maybe you weren't commissioned to do, but it creates value for everybody around and ensures that you don't miss opportunities as you're building out the project. But the inverse of that is even a single infill project should be considered in its very smallest increment. And to the extent you can break it down into small increments, you can get a finer and finer grain that responds better to the neighborhood urbanistically. And then finally, depending on the funding and ownership structures, projects can be internally subsidizing of one part, enabling the other. And that's the issue of some of it being home ownership, some of it being low-income housing tax credit, and the one actually providing kind of basis for the other for the deal to work out. The second project, and I'm not sure what my time frame is, but I'm sure you'll keep me honest, Sarah. Okay. This is a cottage neighborhood. Marcy talked about this, the work they've been doing in the Northwest. This is an example in New England. It's in a town called East Greenwich, Rhode Island, which until recently was my hometown. And it's an interesting town, and I think I'm going to walk you through it just because it's emblematic of towns all over the East Coast, and it has it serves very well as a model. Got the Main Street, which is really the Post Road, which runs from Maine to Florida. On that main street were located the town hall, the police station, the library, the elementary school, the post office, the town playing fields, even the governor's house within walking distance of that. In addition to that, there's Amtrak running parallel to it, and that's roughly true all the way up and down the East Coast. And there's water access, which in times past was real transportation and now is just a recreational amenity. The site is one block off of Main Street, was in this what I call the hinge location between the commercial and the residential neighborhoods. And you can see in this photo right here, Main Street being down there with a kind of commercial plaza, the back of which you're seeing right there, then the remnants of the neighborhood fabric with this existing cottage which was on the site. Here's an aerial of it. Again, you're looking at the back of the CVS. That's the existing cottage on the site, and this was, as you can see by the markings on the ground, it was formerly a auto body repair shop. And this just indicates one digression, the opportunity that this kind of site represents, because it exists everywhere from Maine to Florida, mostly in New England. But there are all of these as the fabric of our retail life moved out to the interchange. What was left before was a slightly decanted Main Street, which is not as destroyed as everybody has the impression it was. There's all this great fabric there, but it's just housing a clock repair shop and a consignment shop. Well, that represents an opportunity to us, especially when you're talking about infill. And I thought I'd just display that pattern a little more. Here again is the Post Road. This is typically in towns in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, there's one layer of commercial, and it's very abruptly turns into small-scale residential. This site happens to occupy a hinge right between the two, which represents both an opportunity and a problem. Again, this site being one where we saw the town had identified it as high-density residential. We saw that it was going to be a permitting problem, and so did everyone else. So we looked very closely at what different types of housing models could achieve the density that this thing was intended for, but also be permittable. And obviously all the old standbys come by of the workers' cottages and of all various stripes all over the country, which become models for us to look at. So our proposal ended up with 15 units on a little under 1 acre, so about 16 units to the acre, arranged in a cottage court neighborhood with common gardens. We had a cutting garden in the front and a vegetable garden in the back, a formal green at the front. This is the existing cottage, common parking, and from the common parking you filter through along pathways to all the units. The units are a mix of detached single families at about 850 square feet. They're tiny little units, and to be quite frank, they're probably too small for the market. We sold them all, but I think we did it in spite of the unit plans. They were not trying to be cute or cheeky or architecturally reconsider the vernacular. This is the vernacular of the workers' cottages that exist in this town, and we took it literally. A second type was slightly, had all the bedrooms upstairs, and again, it's a very simple unit with all of the hard stuff of stairs and plumbing lined up against one wall so that you could create an opaque wall for the adjacent neighborhood, and then a simple living space in between. And then those were reconfigured into a series of singles and duplexes of different care and one triple, where we expressed the individual cottage by staggering it back and forth. This is the section or an elevation view at Green Street itself, and this is a section view down the center of the courtyard looking back to the west. In the permitting approval, we did much the way Marcy did in her context. We presented them with what their zoning suggested, and we did that right off the bat. We said, okay, listen, you've identified this as high-density residential. Within your own zone, this is what you're proposing. And we gave this design at the first public hearing. We said, okay, this is what your zoning is directing us to. But wouldn't you rather have something like this, where the largest element of the whole project is no larger than the abutters to the west? And when we showed them this sequence of slides and we showed them, okay, this is the same number of units with the same amount of parking and the same amount of coverage, why would you make us jump through hoops to build this when, if we could build the other by right? And that was an absolutely logical argument which diffused any objection. We showed them that the frontage as it affected the public realm, which is the area they should be concerned about, that we were matching that in scale and in rhythm and in height, and that fact in and of itself made any objections go away, even to the abutter directly to the west of us right there, who stood up and said, that looks great, I'd love to have it next door. One other point, and I would like to recognize John Ford from Morris Beacon, who's in the audience tonight, and he did all of the site design, and it's just a digression to say that this is the kind of site design that we've gotten used to and we expect in a normal course of events. In a project like this, we had a huge amount of permeable surface, including the roofs and the driveways to deal with. And in a normal course of event, the two green spaces would have been taken over by the civil engineer and turned into beautiful puddles like that. What John suggested was that we take every available surface in here and we do a system of infiltration and bioswale, and then we make the infrastructure be actually part of the amenity for the neighborhood. So every condition where we had to create drainage, and we did it at a very micro level, is something that adds value and creates a landscape theme. Even the points where that kind of approach creates conflicts becomes a little bridge for you to get over from the walkway to the unit. You create a little walkway that goes over. I'm still waiting for a lot of the senior women to go off the edge of these things and break their hip, but so far that hasn't happened, and in the meantime it's very nice to look at. Where we did in fact have to have some conventional structures, but they were greatly minimized and the overall cost was less than the conventional system. So I just wanted to show. Well, that was supposed to be a really cool animation, but it's not going to happen. So just some images to show you what what it looks like now in its built condition. We suffered. We came out of the ground exactly as the market tanked, or was really at its bottom in 2008, and we suffered like everybody else. And so it only just sold out after turning over a couple of times. But relative to everything else in the area, it's been incredibly successful. One other point, and I think I'm not going to go on to the third part, but I will make a point that when we were brought into this project, we actually inserted ourselves in this project. The developers had a previously abandoned commercial scheme for the site. We had been introduced to this idea of cottages and approached them and said, with a full-blown design, and said, listen, this is what you should be doing. You should can that other commercial thing. And they said, great, that's a wonderful idea. What's your fee? And we said, well, our fee is X, but we also want to be partners in this. And we didn't know anything about being partners as developers, and we didn't do that because we wanted to get a cut of the pie. We did that because we recognized that this was going to be a demonstration project, and we needed a place at the table to make sure that it came off the way we intended it to come off and the way we were selling it in public, that it was going to come off. And that really paid off in one way. It didn't pay off at all financially, but it paid off in that we kept a level of quality, and we were able to represent it to the public in a way that it actually was manifested. So I think there are a lot of lessons for this in infill. The design is one of them, but not least of which is just the architect or the designer maintaining control throughout, because at these adjacencies and these infill sites, you can't miss it. You can't get it wrong because you don't get another chance. And there was one other point that I was going to make, but I can't remember what it is. So thank you.
I always forget the most witty and brilliant comments, so I'm sure it would have been good. All right, and last but not least, Mr. Sharp, you're up.
My name is Rob Sharp. I'm an architect in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Sarah asked me to talk about this project that we did called the Metro Building, and she asked that I share numbers and really go into more detail about the development process and how it works and what the pitfalls could be. Can you hear me? Yeah. So this project was a building that. So the next. Sorry. Okay. It's located in Fayetteville, Arkansas. It is the square that says Metro Building around it with the green line between it. The green line is a part of our trail system. There's another rail spur that parallels the trail system, so we're essentially between two railroad tracks at an area where all the street grids break down. It was an existing building that had started life as a place where they made fried chicken TV dinners. So the trains would come up and they'd load all the chickens off, and they would come into the basement and come out they would come in the top and they would come out the basement. But anyway, it was a real hardcore industrial food processing facility. About 30 years ago, they closed down that process, and it became a storage building, place for small sort of strange spaces that didn't need any daylight or any good access, and it became just sort of this three-dimensional puzzle of odd spaces, and there was no maintenance done for a 30-year period, and so the building slowly degenerated, the rents went down. One family owned it, and they finally ran it out to the end of its life, and then they had to sell the building. That's what the building looks like today, and what I wanted to go through is sort of talk about the process of how that happened. And this is the piece when Dover Coal did their master plan for the Fayetteville downtown. They completed the other side of the block, so it shows how it's going to help build our fabric in the downtown. This is the project team, and as you can see, it's a really, really flat project team. It's got one person. It's Brian Rondell, my client, in the polo sport shirt, and he is the developer. He's the only investor. He's the project manager. He's the project superintendent. And I forgot to add, he's also the leasing agent and does all the property management. And it's him. And when things got really rough, he did hire a part-time secretary to help him, but basically he did all this himself. And then I did the architecture, and we hired a few professionals as we needed them. And then the key thing is this direct relationship and indirect relationship with the subcontractors. And I want to go through the timeline a little bit and just talk about how it happened, because I do think that it's this is more than just a war story type project. I think it's a real good model for how people should think about developing today. First of all, is the way he and I apologize for all this text. I know you want to see pretty pictures instead, but I want to get into some level of detail. But the first thing he did is his business was printing T-shirts, and he had rented a space in the back of this building to print T-shirts for college kids, because when they have a party, they have to have a T-shirt to commemorate the party. And so he had this place, and he was doing a good business with the T-shirts, and he heard that the building was for sale, and he was looking around for other space to move his T-shirt place, and then he got the idea that, well, I'll try to buy this building, because they were having problems selling it because the cost of the building was identical to the value of the land, but that didn't factor in the cost it would take to tear the building down. So it was difficult for someone to actually come up with the money for the building. And eventually he was able to work out a deal with the owners that they would finance him for 30-year fixed rate for 10% down. And it was a $1 million purchase price. So it was real. He could go into the deal because he felt protected from interest rate swings. He didn't have to come up with as much money out of pocket as for a traditional deal. And I think the reason that the landlords were willing to sell him the buildings because he was the one that always paid his rent on time without being asked. And so he built up a little bit of trust level. Okay, the next thing he did was he looked at the building that he had and he made this analysis of who was in there. He had 3 categories: makes no sense, makes very little sense, and what he called the rest. And the example like the makes no sense, there was a place that was doing welding, and they were paying $2 a square foot, all utilities paid. And so they probably had a negative utility bill, the welding company. So he got, he went to the trouble of installing a meter, so they paid their own electricity, and just went to the tenants one by one and told them that they were going to have to increase their rent. He expected to lose a lot of them, but most of them stayed because they did realize it was a good deal. But the critical thing is that he got the building to a point where it had a good positive cash flow. And so instead of being sort of a borderline thing, he was getting positive cash flow from the building, which helped do the rest of it. Number 3 was we began to convert the space to higher use space. And that's the point that I got involved with the project. And so you can see a lot of the really good decisions were made before the architect ever showed up. And so we're at a point where he sees the potential to convert the building. He's got the challenge of how do you get people to rent space in a building that looks terrible and has, anyway, the issue was how to get people to pay more. And he took the solution of taking each piece of the building and sort of like the ships are compartmentalized. He would take one little piece and make it nice. And he did do that with borrowed money, but eventually he was able to get the rates up and get to close to market rates. They range from about $9 to $18 a square foot, and to put that in context, in our market, $12 is about the average rent for commercial space. So he got pretty good, managed to bring it up to the market level. And then number 5, after the renovation, at that point he's up to about $3.7 million in debt, including the purchase price of the land. So it's really a project cost. And then he refinances to the 5-year lock on his note. And the building is about 70% occupied. And then at that point he feels it's stable enough that he's been advised he can get non-recourse financing, and so he starts that process and pays those fees. And then number 7, some purchaser shows up, and they've got to have this building, and so they're willing to pay him $6 million for this building that he bought for $1 million and put this time into. And he sells it, and he has no regrets, and he feels like he's done good work. And then the purchaser converts it to HPR, to horizontal property regime. The purchaser's idea was to take this building, cut it up into different office loft units, and then sell them off at a profit. And that came to a bad end for that developer. And also, not only did the developer go insolvent, but the entire bank failed that was backing the loan. So it spun into limbo. And then finally, 5 years later, the person that bought the loan from the bank, that bought the loan from anyway, long way down the line, the original developer's approached, because he's the one that has cash, and is asked is he interested in buying the building back? And in fact, he is. And so he buys the building back at $30 a square foot. It's like the giving tree. And then he invests another $1 million in the building, and this time primarily to create residential loft apartments on the upper floor. And we were talking about the other day when I was getting ready for this presentation, I said, well, did we even talk about doing residential at the beginning of the process? And he said, well, I remember we talked about it, but it was just too overwhelming, that he thought these office loft apartments were about all he could handle. Because the other thing, this is his first development project. He had built his house for himself, and this is really his first building. And this is a situation where a lot of really smart, talented professional developers were losing everything, and he's this T-shirt printing guy that's done this great project. So, and at the end of the day, he's got, thinks it's worth about $4.5 million, and the annual cash flow is $200,000. And I think one of the key things I didn't stress enough was that because he had that positive cash flow at the beginning, he could afford to do everything space by space. And most developers talk about carrying costs, which is what they're out of pocket every month as they're doing a project. He had the opposite situation, where if he would delay, he would actually make a little more money. And it really gave him that, since he could do it at its own pace, he could have built the space as he had a tenant for it, and he got his market research through that leasing process. So he has always got good current information about where the market was and who was interested. And I'm going to try to go through this as briefly as I can, but this is having watched him work, I saw these are the things that he did that tend to be successful, and they all look like the things that your parents tell you to do, like you wonder why there's not always wear your seatbelt and brush your teeth on this list. But I think it's just really important for people thinking about development to be able to say that they're doing all these things, at least 10 of the 11. The first is he was very, very financially cautious. He tried to keep his debt ratio at about 50%. The second was he had a real clear focus on the project. He was doing one project, and that was it. That was his full-time job. His office was in that building, so he'd come to work every day at 8 o'clock and work at that place and then leave at 5. He had no partners and no outside investors, which was very important. He had no realtors or leasing agents, and the reason was he didn't want to save those fees or anything. He just felt that he wanted to really be in touch with who was interested in leasing the space and sort of be on the ground, as it were, with that. He was his own general contractor. He says, only buy real estate you know. He knew the building because he had been a tenant there and he knew the area. He said location is critical. Attention to detail was really important when he was doing this process. Even though he was doing basically sort of manufacturing, warehouse, office spaces, he was replacing the old windows with divided light wood windows. So he had a vision of where that thing was going to go eventually. He asked tons of questions. Of the clients I've had, he's been the most inquisitive, and he would ask everybody that he worked with at every level to explain every aspect of what they did. So he was very inquisitive, and that helped a lot. He was a good communicator, and he always had a reputation for being fair and open with everybody. So that's what made it work. And I don't think the 11th is a requirement to work a 40-hour week, but that's the way he did it. So it was really amazing what he was able to get done within a full-time job. And then the architect's approach. Our first goal was to create order out of chaos, because the building was like a medieval village that had been built in the ruins of a Roman town. It was just this mess, and so we just came in and tried to cut clear circulation and provide storefronts and things like that. We convinced him to really invest more money in the common areas to overcome the stigma that the building had developed. We felt it was important to break down the mass of the building. At one time, this whole building was just a big gray box, and so we convinced him that it needed to sort of pick out individual areas with different materials so that the building was more legible. And we also we had a certain amount of resources to reskin parts of the building, about 15% of the exterior, and we had to pick and choose the places where that was most effective. And we also worked really closely with the developer, right, which was the contractor. And for example, instead of doing shop drawings, we would draw something. He'd say, "Where does that come from?" And we'd say, "Well, it comes from this place, in Fort Smith." And he goes, "Well, can I give you my credit card number so you can order it so they'll deliver it?" And so we got really involved with the details, and it helped the whole process to be that aware of what was going on. This is just a plan of the first floor. You can see how it's sort of been, the shape of the building is the shape of what's left over after the railroad tracks. These are the interior spaces that we created. We had so much space in the building, we felt we could oversize the corridors and hallways in order to provide some social areas, and also just to again, deal with the stigma of the building before. We had these really narrow passageways and level changes. We invested in high-quality bathrooms and a nice leasing office, again, because those are the things that people were extra sensitive about because of the previous nature of the building. We did a lot of these sort of bolt-on things where we had to provide signage and lighting and new entrances, and we tried to find a real simple way to something that could be welded in the shop and then bolted onto the building. We used a variety of exterior materials to, again, make the building more legible. This is his marketing program. He invested in a banner to put on the building. You can see he's cast his net pretty wide. We had one of our big tenants for a long time was a church on the upstairs because they wanted a real non-church church location. And then I'm calling this the advantages to the architect of this incremental flat project team approach. And one of the biggest things is you don't have these meetings where the value engineer and the owner's rep and the leasing agent, all these people put in their 2 cents. And I know I've had some projects that all have really professional, well-intentioned, smart people get together in a room and make bad decisions or delay, so that we didn't have any of that. Also, one thing that really helped me was it evened out the building cycle, because on a typical project, as you're in like the CD phase, everybody's working really hard, and there's a huge burst of fee and work, and then you'll get to a different phase and things will slow down. With this, we were sort of constantly in schematic design development, construction and construction administration. Just a nice ongoing project, which made it less stressful and helped financially. We also get instant gratification. We would draw something one day, and the next day they're building it. One of my examples here is a partition schedule. And if you've done a partition schedule for an existing rehab building with different fire rating details, it can be a lot of tedious work drawing all the different conditions. And so what we did instead, we just got cans of different colored spray paint. I mean, I understood the code and what the rating had to be. We just run around and hit each stud with the spray paint of what it is, and that way I didn't have to do all these complicated drawings, and the project manager didn't have to explain it to the guy that ran the sheetrock crew, who explained it to the people that actually hung the sheetrock. It was a much more direct approach. And going through the building doing the spray paint took 2 hours, so it was a time saver in every way. One thing that was really good about the project was we got to deal directly with the subcontractors, and so there was never this architect subcontractor tension. We were all knew each other and knew that we were all human. And then the last thing is that a lot of the money that he saved by this reduced overhead process went directly into the building, so it's a building that we can all be proud of. And then this is a slide from, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, where they opened up a co-working space in the basement. So you can see that sort of the last piece of the puzzle was to move this. There was this corner in the basement we never could figure out, and finally the co-working people showed up. So that's it.
Well, thank you all. Does anybody have any questions of our panelists, or are there issues in your own work that we can discuss, bring about?
While you all are thinking about questions, I remembered the brilliant insight that I had that I forgot earlier. One of the things, the points that I wanted to make is, there are 2 points. Both of the projects that I showed were made possible by something in Rhode Island called the comprehensive permit process. In Massachusetts, it's called the 40B process, and I'm sure that exists in other states, but I'm not aware of what it's called there. Basically, that's a consolidated approvals process where a single board, in Rhode Island it's the planning board, is empowered to grant all of the relief that a project would need in exchange for that project delivering some amount of affordable housing. And the point I want to make is that is the most powerful tool for a community to get over its own zoning ordinance, which typically makes all of this infill almost impossible to do, because the zoning was written long after those lots were platted, and they're always dimensionally non-conforming. So this idea of a comprehensive permitting process where a single, in Rhode Island we call it the super board, the planning board gets all the powers of the zoning board, and to a certain extent the town council, to be able to grant relief in a holistic way. So what that means in effect is that you can design a project the way it's supposed to be designed, and then back into the level of relief that you need to make that happen, and then they can grant that in one fell swoop. It kind of limits the opportunity for the NIMBYs to get in and contest every single fact of the development, and really at the level of infill, where it's always an atypical situation, that's a really important tool. So that's the one point I wanted to make, which I didn't make. And the other one was that typically whenever we're doing an infill project where there is relief required, I always tell our clients, if our clients are separate from ourselves, do not dip your toe in the water in this, where you slide a drawing across with 10 units on an engineer's site plan and say, what do you think about this? Could we get this approved? Because the answer will always be no. They'll count up the numbers, or they'll say, maybe you could if it were 6, some random number less than the number you're proposing. What we did in Green Street is the first time anyone ever saw that project, we had the whole thing designed down to animations and to the whole argument in the public process, and it so blew everybody's hair back that there was no conversation left, and nobody was debating whether or not 14 units would be better than 15 units. They could see that the design was a holistic, complete entity. And so in this infill stuff, I always advise, especially because it's a smaller project and it's possible to do it, go in with your guns fully loaded and everything figured out and present it, really pull back the velvet and let it rip, and don't just sort of test the waters in the public arena, because you'll never get anywhere.
All right, I actually have a question. As sort of we're talking about new economy and small projects and infill and redevelopment, where you were mentioning, where Don, you just said about relief, and you talked about low-income tax credits. What if that doesn't exist any longer? And I think in the instance from what you were saying, the project probably wouldn't have, Trinity specifically, probably wouldn't have occurred, but you used the term internally subsidizing. So is there a way that the market rate units could have been high enough to possibly keep the apartment units still in the affordable range?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably a different answer for every project. And I know I just noticed that Buff Chase is in the audience, and I think a lot of his projects he looks at as a whole, where some portion of that may not be performing, but that's allowing another portion it's being subsidized by another proportion that is performing. So depending on where the market is at any given moment, the market might be for retail, and that might actually support some development of residential, or the market might be for residential, and that might allow the creation, even if it's not profitable in the short term, of retail. And so I think that even in a non-publicly funded project, there's ways, if the project is not looked at like a monoculture where it's a single product that you're selling, and you're willing to look at it as that complex organism and see the health of the whole thing as being the end goal as opposed to the profitability of every single point, then there probably is opportunity to do that. I'm kind of talking out of my hat because that's more of a developer than
I'm aware I put you on the spot. So thank you for humoring me. I'm going to put Marcy on the spot next. With the, and still sort of thinking along the lines of affordable housing, as you said, a lot of what has been developed in the Pacific Northwest so far ends up being quite expensive, even though they're smaller products. Is it probably something that's just a matter of exposure and extent and getting more of it that will keep the price lower, perhaps? Or is there something that might need to be artificially put in place to make these small lots, small cottages affordable?
But I think this is a difficult issue. I'm not a affordable housing expert. I do think there are affordable housing programs that could help subsidize the construction of these, and programs that keep the rents or the sales price lower, for a period of time are the only way I can think of that those lower prices would be maintained. And I know that can be done. I just think it adds another level of detail that makes it more difficult to get this type of housing. I think supply and demand is a big part of the answer. If there's just a lot more of this housing available in a wide range of different locations and neighborhoods, I think the price won't be such an issue. But right now, there's an under supply and an over demand. Lots of people want to live in these kind of units, and they're usually built in pretty nice neighborhoods or neighborhoods that are becoming much more comfortable. Maybe they're neighborhoods that are in transition, and so they're very popular, and there's just not enough of them, and there are more people that want to live in them than are being created.
I can add to that. The Green Street cottages that I showed, those were a density bonus of 5 units, or actually it was 7 units, was allowed because we dedicated a third of them to be deed restricted affordable. What's really nice about the cottage model, especially when you get up to the densities that we got up to, is that the basic market rate price for those things is not so far off of the price that's deemed affordable by area median income. So In fact, we didn't need any subsidy at all to deliver 5 units as deed restricted affordable because the project as a whole was profitable. We ultimately agreed to offer 3 of the 5 units at 80% of area median income, which is just a way of calculating what the maximum price can be, and 2 of the units at 120% of area median income. And what happened was that the 3 at 80% covered their costs, which is in contrast to most affordable housing projects where, because of the unit type is all the same or because it's of a certain size, those things are always going to be a burden on the project. Well, in this case, it wasn't a burden. It allowed us to, 2 of the units still made money, the affordable units, and the other ones made a decent amount of money. But by virtue of the fact that the units were small and that we got 15 units per acre, the cost of these things was the highest price unit for, I think, 950 square feet was $279,000, which at least in our market was pretty attractive. So I think it sort of echoes what you said. If you can get the numbers, if the size is intrinsically small, and if you're really designing to the right market and not trying to offer a suburban market, some second-rate house with granite condo and granite counters and all the bells and whistles, and instead what you're selling it as is an unbelievable apartment that you happen to have a place for your barbecue and a garden and windows on all 3 sides. That helped kind of make the whole thing work out without any subsidy at all.
I just want to mention, too, to echo what you're saying, these are intrinsically less expensive units, and you can build in higher quality materials and still have them be less expensive to sell. And also because they don't have as much parking, typically they're cheaper. But I think there are 2 problems. I just want to make it clear that what I was talking about their being expensive is that they're both sold for a lot more because they're so popular, or they're resold later. So you can, maybe they're part of an affordable housing project next year and they're sold at a price that's set, but that doesn't guarantee, unless there's a program in place, that they will be resold for that at that affordable rate.
And there is a point when you're building the smaller cottage, the cost per square foot does go way up. I mean, you don't have that bonus room to stretch out the square footage, and it's a tricky. You can shrink it so far that it doesn't work. And I wonder if, Don, you had, when you were working with your price per square foot on your cottages, how did that come out?
You know, as an absolute cost, we were within the comparables, but if anybody was comparing cost per square foot, we were the highest thing selling in that market by a huge percentage. But another lesson out of that project was that when you deliver something that the market hasn't seen and really, really wants, suddenly the calculus that they're doing where they're comparing apples to apples goes away. They stop saying, well, I can go down the street and get another 500 square feet for the same money. They're not doing that. And I said in my talk that we really kind of screwed up on the unit design. I don't believe people really liked the floor plans. I believe they bought these units in spite of the fact that they didn't like them, because they wanted to be in this place that we had created. Somehow the sense of place with the gardens and the porches and the being on Main Street was so strong and palpable that people were willing to put themselves into a, Andreas calls it a Lutheran punishment cabin. I'm overstating it. They weren't Lutheran punishment cabins. They were pretty nice things, but they I think they were willing to compromise on a lot of things that if they had gone to a real estate agent and said, what do you want in a cottage, they would have listed a bunch of things and we wouldn't have delivered. It was once you walked in and saw the place, which is another point. I've got full of points today. I think it's really important in these infill things that if it's possible to build it first, that's the thing that sells it. It's when we were on paper, we had a lot of pre-sales because we had rendered it so fully. And then when it started to come out of construction, the pre-sales just stopped. It was a big muddy pit and nobody wanted to go near it. As soon as the landscape went in, the people were just flying through there. And so I think that's another lesson for these small projects.
Well, thank you all. And it sounds like the big lesson, the takeaway today is even though we might be architects by training or urbanists by choice or developers by inheritance, the idea is that our markets are changing and communication is going to be the big wave of the future. So it's we're all going to have to play a lot more nice than we already do. So thank you all for coming.